Fantastic. Well, let's get started here. Thank you very much for joining us today. I'm Nick Bray from NBA. NBA is an architecture studio based near City Hall in Vancouver on the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. It's often said that the architects need to know a little about a lot of subjects. We don't need to know everything, but we need to know when to ask questions and when to carry out further research. The intent of this seminar is to provide an overview of the changes within the 2024 BC Building Code. It will give you a basis to know when and where to delve deeper. My office has been working closely with Celerity Engineering for many, many years now. We work with them on a day-to-day basis, and they're an important extension of our office. They've also navigated us through some really challenging code-related situations, so we're very grateful to them for their work. And they're always there for us, and there to answer our questions. Talking of questions, if you have any during the seminar, please feel free to write them in the chat box. We'll address them at the end of the session. But please be aware that there's a lot of people attending this seminar. I think we had over 400 people sign up. So we won't be able to answer every question, but please feel free to ask a short question. The seminar is being recorded, and we'll make that recording available afterwards. And regarding your AIBC learning credits, towards the end of the seminar, we will post a link in the chat box, which you can enter your membership number, and it will automatically provide those credits. Just looking at the poll here, it's great to see we were aiming for architects, so majority architects and intern architects. That's great to see. So yeah, in a second, I'll hand over to Brian Fraser from Celerity Engineering. Brian is registered as a professional engineer in BC, Alberta, and Saskatchewan, and has a certified professional license registered in Vancouver and Surrey since 2012. So over to you, Brian.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks for the introduction. And thanks everyone for joining us today. We've had a rather unexpected turnout. We thought maybe we'd get 50 people and had over 400 sign up. I see the numbers up to almost 250 now have joined in the meeting, which is great. And we're really excited to be able to present to you today. A little bit about yourself, and Nick has already given a bit of a talk, but Marc is going to be presenting today. Marc is an engineer who joined us back in almost 9 years ago, which is hard to believe. It's surprising how time flies.
Yeah.
Joined straight out of school, finished at UVic, and joined us, and has since obtained his P.Eng and also his CP. Marc is our lead in our Victoria office, and with a focus on supporting projects on Vancouver Island. Marc, as I mentioned, Marc is also CP, and he's currently has one Vancouver project that he's working on as well. I just want to mention that we're excited to present today. We wanted to bring this topic forward with a new code, bring awareness to it and so forth. And we also wanted to also increase and develop new relationships in the industry as part of our just reasons for doing this today. I hope you enjoy the presentation, and Marc, if you want to take it away.
Absolutely. Brian, did you want to talk a little bit about our company too? I don't know. Just a quick overview here.
Certainly. Briefly, we're a full-service code consultant firm. We have offices in Vancouver and Victoria. We also have a presence in Regina as well. One lonely person out there. We offer all the typical services, certified professional, alternative solutions. We do lots of building code review, appeal preparation. We do independent review for projects on port lands or on native lands and so forth. Also S1000 run of work that's all coming into the play these days, and a myriad of other things. So.
Okay, great. Okay, so this is a brief overview of some of the things we're going to talk about today. As Nick mentioned, the goal for this presentation is to give you a sense of some of what we think are the big changes that you should be aware of. You certainly won't come away from this presentation knowing everything, I don't think, but I hope that you'll know a little bit more about where to look and maybe some of the things that are most impactful on your design, particularly early on in your design phase, so you don't get caught with some larger issues, along with some sort of more specific technical issues that might come up during construction. As noted here, the 2024 BCBC came into effect on March 8th of this year. So that's anywhere that's using the BC building code. Obviously in Vancouver, they have their own building bylaw. So that will still be the 2019 Vancouver building bylaw until they will be reviewing the 2024 BC building code and adopting their new edition of the Vancouver building bylaw at some point. I expect in the next year or so, but we don't have that yet. A bit of a unique thing that they did this time around when implementing the 2024 BCBC is a few of the new requirements have this transition period. So adaptable dwelling units and earthquake design changes won't actually come into effect until March 10th of next year to allow this transition period. Those requirements are in the 2024 BCBC, so you can see them. They just aren't officially required until next year. And then something new that came out just last week is there were some revisions to the 2024 BCBC already for encapsulated mass timber changes. So we won't be covering any of that today. So just be aware if you are doing an encapsulated mass timber project or looking to, there are some new revisions that have been released already. So it is an evolving document, and I expect it'll continue to evolve. So we'll dive right in now. We'll kind of go through the code more or less in order. So it's not a list of, it's not in the list of most impactful changes or anything. So the first thing we've noted here, we wanted to talk about was window frames and blocking. So this applies to any building that's required to be non-combustible construction. Subsection 315, if you have a non-combustible building, that's where you have to go. So in that subsection, there's a lot of allowances to have combustible components within a non-combustible building. So a couple of exceptions have been added. So this actually makes things a little bit easier. They've clarified that wood blocking is allowed for attaching window elements. There used to be some confusion about that, whether you could have plywood backing or some timber frames for just attaching window elements. So that's okay. Now it's been clarified. And the other second item on here is combustible windows and sashes, so window frames, are allowed in a non-combustible building as long as they're vertically non-contiguous between stories. So that basically means you don't have a curtain wall system with windows just from floor to ceiling and then floor to ceiling on the next level. So this comes up a lot, I find, in renovation projects. You might have a tower where they're looking to replace the windows and they're wondering if they can use vinyl window frames, for example. You used to be able to do it, but there were quite a few restrictions on area and distance between the windows. So it's much more simple now. As long as you're vertically non-contiguous, you can use those. All right, next we have a topic that's been caused quite a lot of confusion, I think, in the past. It's all about fire separations and joint fire stopping. So previously in the code 3183, it talks about how do you maintain the continuity of your fire separations. So you have a gypsum board wall butting up into a masonry wall or some other type of construction, two dissimilar types of construction. What do you have to do there? It used to just say you need to maintain the continuity. It didn't really tell you how to do that. So this has been clarified quite a bit. It now actually has a standardized test that you need to provide. And this is a a system that's tested to CAN-ULC S115 and has an FT rating that's the same as the fire resistance rating of the two abutting fire separations. This is something that's been done, I think, quite a bit in industry previously, but now it's actually written into the code this way. So just be aware of that. Exterior wall joints similarly have been clarified. They provided this ASTM test standard that you need to meet. Often what would come up before is a municipality would request an engineering judgment or an alternative solution to allow you to use a system that was tested to this standard. So just be aware, if you have this situation, you need to have if you have a curtain wall system, you do need an actual tested fire stop there between the curtain wall and the slab edge. And then gypsum board joints are the exception to this rule. You don't need a tested system between two pieces of gypsum board. You just do your regular mudding and taping there. There's nothing really unique that has to be done. Okay, mid-rise construction. This is specific to 5- and 6-story light wood frame construction types. There's a few relaxations that have been added in here, actually. You may know, if you've done these types of buildings previously, you had to have 10% of the building perimeter within 50 meters of a street. So that requirement was actually removed. So now you just need to have you still have to have your principal entrance within 15 meters of the street, but there's no minimum perimeter. So I don't think this will affect many projects, but it will allow some different sites to use this construction. If you have a long, narrow site, this might come into play. And then there's been allowance in here to use some combustible cladding for these types of buildings. Previously, it was really limited to non-combustible cladding, but they've added an allowance for up to 10% of cladding on an exterior wall that is within 15 meters of a street or access route for fire department to be combustible cladding. So kind of a feature wall that's close to the street, you can have a bit of combustible cladding there. So just a bit of extra flexibility for these types of buildings, which is nice. I'll probably go through most of this stuff fairly quickly until we get to washrooms, because it's relatively straightforward. And accessibility in washrooms is where a bulk of the changes have come in. So bear with me if I go through some of this a little bit quickly. Door widths, so egress and accessibility alignment. There's been an increase in the required door width from 800 to 850 clear width. That's applied in 3.3, so that's sort of 3.3 is safety within floor areas. So that would be most places in your floor area or your floor. And then also in 3.4 for exits. So those have also increased to 850. So you'll have to make sure that you're meeting that. Generally, that would mean a 3-foot door in most locations. Tactile warning. This was a bit of source of confusion in the past. The code wasn't really super clear where you needed these things, or if you did need them in exit stairs. So it's been clarified that you don't need them in enclosed exit stairs anymore, or just enclosed stairs in general. So most cases, exit stairs, you wouldn't need them. You would need them in if you had an open stair to a mezzanine or an interconnected floor space, you would need them there. I believe the intention is that if somebody is going into an exit stair, even if they're visibly or visually impaired, they don't have, or they're generally expected to be aware that they're going into a exit stair. And there's some new requirements around signage that we'll talk about in a minute to address that. But any unenclosed stair or other types of drop-off edges you will need to have a tactile warning. And the standard has been clarified, or how these things need to be designed has been clarified. They now need to comply with the CSA B651 accessibility standard. So that'll look like something like this. You're seeing these more and more places, these truncated domes, I believe they're called. So if you're reviewing product information, you will probably just need to check that it does meet that standard. You can't just apply like a strip of sandpaper or something. Sometimes you used to see that. There wouldn't really be much done there. So it's a little bit more standardized now what you need to do. Just be aware of that. Safety glazing. So this has to do with wired glass. Now, I think wired glass has been a bit of a contentious topic in recent years. It doesn't achieve an impact rating, or that I think it maybe used to, but that's been removed. So there's a risk of injury if these things, somebody runs into these things, can be quite severe. So you could still use wired glass, especially where there's a fire rating required. That hasn't changed. The only thing that's been changed is this new requirement in 332 for specific to assembly occupancies. They need to have a safety film added to the wire glass so that it does achieve an impact rating. So you can use the wire glass, but it gets a laminate applied to it so that you can't break through it anymore, basically. And that also applies to showers and bathtubs enclosures. I don't know that I've ever seen wired glass used in those cases, but it does apply if for some reason you were to do that. So again, this is specific to assembly occupancies, at least 33217. So just be aware of that. I think wired glass generally isn't recommended where there's an impact risk, even in other occupancies, but that hasn't really translated into any changes in the code yet. Yeah, so it looks the same as traditional wired glass, but so there's a laminate or film applied to it to achieve the impact rating. There's a couple of exceptions for that. I won't really go through this in detail, but where you have a door and the glazing is above a certain height, or similarly with windows, if they're above a certain height, then you don't need to meet that impact rating anymore. Okay, so now we're going to move into exits 3.4. Couple of relatively minor changes. Ramps. So in 3.4, there's a section on ramps. It would only apply to ramps that aren't in an accessible path of travel, because if you are in an accessible path of travel, you have to go to 3.8 for accessibility. However, 3.4 for ramps, they've actually changed the slope to be a maximum of 1 in 12, which is the same as the accessibility section. So the slope would be the same in either case. The only exception to that is industrial occupancies. They're allowed to be quite a bit steeper for interior ramps, up to 1 in 6, or 1 in 10 for exterior ramps. So that might happen in a parking garage. It could happen. You just have to be a bit careful with that, because if it's in a location that does need to be accessible, which with the new accessibility requirements will be a lot of locations, you would still need to meet 3.8. So just be careful about that if you're going to try and apply this. And then there's also a section on curb ramps, which refers you back to 3.8, which I think then refers you to the CSA B651 accessibility standard. So if you're designing curb ramps, you just need to be aware there's a specific set of rules for those. Handrail dimensions, these have actually increased, so it gives you some more options. Circular handrails up from 43 millimeters to 50, so roughly 2 inches should be okay now. Non-circular, you don't see as many of those, but they've also increased to give you some more options. Okay, so tactile signage. I mentioned this previously, briefly. So this has generally been added throughout the code in 3.4 for exit signage, but also in 3.8 for sort of more wayfinding directional signage. In 3.4, it's most of the life safety type signage. So on exit doors, you need to have a sign that says in visual and in tactile form that it's an exit door. So this is a sign on the door. You still need the illuminated exit signage above your door. So that hasn't changed. So this is just an extra thing you'll need. And similarly, any other location where there's like a life safety signage requirement, it does require that to be provided in visual and tactile form. So a couple examples here: delayed egress exit hardware. So mag locks, crossover floors. So if you have, if you need crossover floors, then those need to be, there's signage requirements to say where those are and which floors they are. So those need to be provided in tactile form, and floor numbering signage within your stairs. So I have a feeling this will likely require some sort of specialty consultant for that. I'm not sure if the signage companies are able to provide that. That's something that you'll probably have to work out with your contractor, but it's something to be aware of for sure once you start to review these shop drawings and things like that. Okay, I think this is probably where we get into some of the more impactful requirements in terms of layouts and early design type of things. So 3.7 is health requirements, and I think most of the changes here are about washrooms, water closets. So just kind of going through this in order. 3.7.2.1, they've added something here just to clarify that the occupant load that you use for calculating the number of water closets has to be the same as the occupant load you used or you determined in 3.1.17. 3.1.17 is where you have that table with all the different factors of how many people per square meter. So I think what this really means is that you can't use a different occupant load for calculating washrooms. For example, staff only washrooms, unless that's specifically allowed in the code. So you can't just say, oh, we're only providing washrooms for staff. There are a couple examples where that's allowed in the code. For example, group E mercantile under 500 square meters. It does specifically say you can do that. But otherwise, you would need to provide washrooms based on staff plus public as you would have calculated it from subsection 3.1.17. There's a couple of exceptions for that, just like very specific things like parking garages where you might have a security desk. You would have to provide washrooms for the staff and the security desk, but you don't need to for all the people in the building that are parking because they're considered transitory. They're just parking and then leaving. They're not expected to use the washroom there. And then the last couple things noted here are quite significant, and they kind of tie into some of the accessibility things we'll get to in a moment. They've deleted the requirement for the single universal washroom not being considered in the count of required water closets. So previously, if you just had one universal washroom in your suite, you couldn't actually count that as a required washroom towards your, meeting the number required by the table. So if the table said you need one male, one female, and you just had one universal washroom, you would need the one universal washroom, a male and a female for 3 total. So that's been removed, which is nice because now you can count that one. And it'll sort of reduce the number of total washrooms you need. That's been like that in the VBBL for a little while, I think. So it's similar to that. But as we'll see, you actually need more universal washrooms. So it's a bit of a trade-off. Okay, so the next few slides, don't worry about what I have. Don't worry about reading on here. It's just to show you that there's a lot of accessibility changes. I'm not going through every single thing. We're kind of go through the main most significant points that, or at least what I feel are the most significant points. So this is like a whole list. You can see there's a lot of little changes. Some of them are just little dimension changes. Things that are being harmonized with the national code, and kind of over time they're just moving slightly here or there, which is a bit frustrating. But I think hopefully eventually we'll land on something that's a little more consistent year to year. There is a full list of changes provided by the Building Official Association of BC. So if you haven't seen that, I would just go to their website. They have a few handouts, one for every part of the code, and everything's kind of listed on there. It tells you what's changed, what's just been relocated, that kind of thing. It's quite helpful. So I would recommend trying to have a look at that if you can. So this is maybe the biggest, or one of the biggest single changes I feel is for washrooms. So tying back into kind of what I was talking about with the universal washroom, 3282 now requires universal washrooms in each location where washrooms are provided. So basically, wherever you have a bank of washrooms, you need to provide a universal washroom. Before, it was really just you needed to have one in the building, or access. People needed to have access to one in the building. So this is quite a bit of an increase. There's some things to offset that a little bit, like allowing you to count this as one of your required washrooms. The one thing that I think is not clear is it just says each location. It's not clear how far apart is acceptable. If you have a bank of washrooms and then you have, down the hallway, you have a couple other washrooms, you need one in each location. That's a little bit, it's going to be open for interpretation, I think. So just, be aware of that. We're all kind of learning how to apply the new code, and I'm sure it'll vary by location. Different people will have different opinions on it, as these things kind of tend to go. So, but yeah, just note that you will need a universal washroom generally wherever you have a bank of washrooms. The second one here is accessible stalls. So wherever you have more than 2 water closets in a washroom, you need an accessible stall. So that's just the larger stall. The difference is the universal washroom is a standalone washroom that's not within a larger washroom with other water closets. The intent of the universal washroom is it allows somebody and their caregiver to enter the washroom, and they're not running into issues with the other gendered washrooms. They have a little more privacy, a little more space. So this is just the larger stall within a multi-stall washroom. So as soon as you have over 2, you need to provide that. I believe there's been some changes to those requirements that I'll mention in a little bit. And then 6 and 7, this new thing about urinals and stalls for persons with limited mobility. So this is kind of like a halfway point between previously there was the accessible stall and then there was just everything else. There was no requirements. So you could have a really small stall. Sometimes you'd end up with these tiny stalls with the door swinging in. You can hardly get in there and move around. This is somewhat of a improvement on that. You only need one of these for every, I think, 10 water closets in your stall. So unless you have a really large bathroom, you're probably just going to need one of these. And it's pretty similar to a sort of what you would typically see for a standard stall, non-accessible stall, but there has to be grab bars and the door has to swing out just to give someone some maneuvering space on the inside. I think it's for somebody who, you know, maybe they're older, maybe they have a walker or a cane or something, and they can't negotiate the toilet and the door when it's all swinging in, and some grab bars to help them get up and down. So those should generally not be too difficult to achieve within what you were designing previously. And then the last one on here is universal dressing and shower room, where showers are provided. So the main addition here is the dressing part of this. There's a requirement for a bench when you have a shower, this universal dressing and shower room. So you'll need a little more space for that. And then the shower requirements themselves are, I believe, more or less the same. Note that it says where showers are provided here. So there's no requirement in the code to provide showers, but if you are providing them, then one of them has to be accessible. I think the biggest thing to note about the showers is it's hard to add a shower as an afterthought on a project because you do need quite a bit of space. So I think I've seen it come up quite a bit on TIs, especially if you have a client who wants, you know, they have a little bit of extra space left over and they try and just add a shower in there for themselves or for their employees. It's really hard to do that because it does need to be an accessible shower, even if it's for employees. It does specifically state in the code, like a public showers or as like an amenity for employees. You have to provide this universal dressing and shower room. Okay, so then signs are just noted here. Tactile information, we talked about that before for exits and life safety. So this is where tactile information for more like wayfinding signage is covered. You don't have to provide it within a suite, but you do within like a public corridor or a, you know, leading to the suite. So it would be like suite numbering signage and any other wayfinding signage you have. Suppose if you had washrooms in a public space, you would need it for that as well. Okay, a couple other fairly significant changes here are entrances and power operators. So in the last edition of the code, it said you needed 50% of your entrances plus the principal entrance to be accessible. That has been changed. Now it just says all pedestrian entrances to an accessible story must be accessible. So the only exceptions really are service entrances and residential suite entries where the suite is not accessible. Otherwise, most of your entrances into the building will need to be accessible. I think there's some debate about whether, you know, an exit stair is an entrance or not. I think the way we've been applying it is that for most exit stair shafts that aren't generally meant for access into the building, it's potentially okay not to treat that as an entrance. But I think it really depends on your situation on the specifics. So definitely be careful about that. You know, if one of the exit stairs is intended as like a staff entrance at the back of the building or something, then it would need to be accessible. Not the stair itself, but the doors in and out of it. And then to go along with that, power operators, it now states that all accessible entrances with self-closing devices have to have at least one door with a power operator, including a vestibule. Previously, it was limited really to only specific occupancies, hotels, B2, A2, over a certain size, things like that. So it's much more broad, kind of generally most entrances will need this now. And also accessible washrooms too. So a lot more power operators will be necessary. Okay. Accessibility removed. So where work functions can reasonably be expected to be performed by persons with disabilities. This was a wording in the previous edition, and it gave a little bit of an out for where you need to provide access, but I think it got applied maybe when it shouldn't have. So it's just been removed. So essentially what that means is that the way the code's written is you need to provide access for persons with disabilities throughout the building, except there's a section here where it talks about access is not required. And then it lays out a whole list of spaces that don't need it. It's quite limited where you don't need to provide it. There is still an exception for small suites, small 2-level suites that was in the previous couple of editions that was BC specific. So that hasn't changed. But generally, I would assume that you do need to provide access for persons with disabilities. That allowance is really limited because if you have a small 2-story suite, you don't need to provide access to the upper level, but you can't have any facilities or uses up there that aren't on the lower level. So it's quite limiting where you don't need it. The other thing that's interesting here is that elevators will be required in apartment buildings over 2 stories or larger 2-story residential buildings. Previously, you could get away without elevators in a lot of residential occupancies. You don't see it too much, but sometimes with additions and things, you would see no elevator, and that's apartment style with a public, common interior space, not row houses, townhouses. Those are still fine. No change there. Okay, a couple of small minor things. Counters, more types of counters will need to be accessible. Previously noted, intended as a work surface for extended business transactions. So just any counter that somebody with disabilities may need to use you'll need to have at least one section of the counter be accessible. In sleeping rooms, bed spaces, increased number of accessible sleeping rooms. That only applies to hotels, motels, dorms, that kind of stuff. So you don't see that too often, but if you're working on that type, just be aware. Okay, so the last kind of section here, I think we have a few slides left, but this all covers 383 for the actual how do you design your accessible facilities, and then 385, which is adaptable, the adaptable stuff, which we'll get into right at the end. So 3832, here we are with accessible path of travel. This stuff seems to change every time the new code comes out. I think most of you will be happy to see that this has actually been reduced from, it was previously 1500 millimeters was required. It's actually now 1000 millimeters is required for your accessible path of travel. If you have a public corridor, that still needs to be 1100. So you'll have to be a bit careful with that. But I think this is good because generally before it just said 1500 everywhere, which didn't make a lot of sense in my opinion, where you had like, you're trying to design within a suite. If you're designing like the space between some desks or something like that, it didn't really clarify if you still needed 1500 there. So 1,000 meters, or sorry, 1,000 millimeters, it's a little easier to achieve. And it does give you a couple diagrams here to kind of clarify the reduced width areas that you're also allowed. So kind of something similar to a doorway, like a small restriction, you're allowed to have that. And then these last two notes here are just about path of travel, where it exceeds 24 millimeters in length. There's bump out spaces that are required for, I think, turnaround and for passing. So if you have a long hallway, you will need a sort of a bump out area every 24 meters. And then turnaround areas, if you do choose to go less than 1,500 wide for your path, then you do need a one of these turnaround areas at the ends. And that's if your path is over 12 meters long. So I think the idea is somebody is in a long, narrow hallway. You don't want them to have to back up to get out of there. They have to have one of these turnaround areas at both ends to be able to turn around and then retreat. So they give you a few options. You can have this 1,700 millimeter diameter space, this 17 by 15, or this T-shaped thing here. So there's a bunch of options. Just be aware. If you're less than 1,500 and you have a long hallway, you need to have space at the end for somebody to turn around. Exterior walk. So this one is a bit odd to me. They've increased the width requirement from 1,500 to 1,600 for some reason. Generally, I don't think it'll be a problem because it's exterior, and usually exterior you have more space, at least to the entrance. And then some clear floor space around the door. I think the next slide has a bit of a diagram to show that. And then there's a reference to the CSA requirement around how to design these things. It kind of covers how you need to have your route separated from a vehicle route. So if you have a walking path, it does need to have a curb, a railing, or a tactile indicator to the adjacent vehicle route. And then there's also requirements around traversing through vehicle areas. I need to look at this a little more detail myself to fully grasp what it means, but I think it's mostly talking about where you're having to cross a drive aisle or something. You need to have like a proper crossing for your path, so somebody's kind of made aware that they're entering a vehicle path. This is the diagram I was mentioning there about at your exterior doorways. You need to have a little bit larger clear floor space. And then this slide also covers ramps, which have been reduced to a minimum width of 1,000 millimeters. And then there's just been some slight changes, I think, to the intervals for intermediate landings. If you have a long ramp, you need it every 9 meters. So if you're designing a ramp, I would just encourage you to check this section, make sure you're meeting everything in there. In general, I don't think it's much more difficult. It's fairly consistent with previous, just some slight changes. So door clearances, this definitely make note of this. I would encourage you to have a look at this diagram, which is in the notes to the building code. So it's all written out in words in the actual body of the code, but I find that a bit hard to understand. So this is definitely helpful. I believe everything in here is correct. I know sometimes they post diagrams and they don't quite line up with the wording, but as far as I know, this is all fine. The biggest changes, I think, are the doors without a power operator on the inward swinging door. So on the approach where you're pulling the door towards you, this the size of this kind of rectangle here has increased. Now it's 1700 by 1500 that you need. It can be in either orientation though, so there's a little bit of flexibility there. You know, if you have you have more space in one direction or the other. But it used to be a bit smaller than that. I believe this is more or less the same. And then sliding doors, I can't recall if that has changed. I don't see too many sliding doors, so but just note that. And then with a power operator, it gets rid of a lot of the side to side clearance, but you still need the depth. The depth doesn't really change. And then this diagram here just shows the door jamb clearances that still needs to be met. That's still the same. So on top of this, you have to meet these. I think if you're meeting the clear floor space requirements shown over here, that you will likely already achieve this. Maybe not if you have a really wide door, but for most standard doors, this shouldn't be a problem at that point. Okay, well, this is a small change, just minimum platform depth or platform sizes for elevators. I don't think that'll affect many projects unless you have a very small lift. So just be aware of that. There's still some stretcher requirements which apply to most elevators. So make sure that you are aware of those. Doesn't apply to things like limited application, limited use elevators. Okay, so I mentioned this before. This is just the accessible stall that we were talking about briefly. So the dimensions have changed for in front of the stall. So you do need a 17 by 1700 clear floor space in front of the stall now. I think that was 1500 perhaps before. So that has increased. I mean, the size of the washroom here is getting quite large. So do be aware of that. And then the other thing that I've noticed on the projects I've been looking at so far that keeps getting missed is this door here is meant to be next to the transfer space. So the location of your toilet does actually matter. If this was over here, it wouldn't comply unless the door was shifted over. So be aware of that. I mean, in this case, the grab bars would have to be mounted to the partition wall, which I'm not a structural engineer, so I'm not sure how that changes things, but it's definitely something you would have to consult with the structural engineer on and the contractor to make sure that those loads are being considered. Okay, universal washroom design. This just covers the universal washroom. The main change here is just there's no minimum room dimensions. Instead, they've required this 1700 millimeter diameter turning space. That diagram's in the back of the code as well, so you can have a look at that. I don't think there's any major changes there. The biggest one for universal washrooms is just how many or where they need to be located. Okay, that kind of covers everything for accessibility. As you can see, there's a lot there. I think the biggest things are the washroom requirements and perhaps the door clearances. So the last thing we'll go through today, and this is relatively brief just because this isn't adopted into the code yet, it's the adaptable dwelling unit requirements. I would encourage you to try and adopt as much of this as you can beforehand, before it even comes into effect, or at least become aware of what's going to be needed in case you have any projects that are at risk of not getting in for building permit before March 10th of next year. There's nothing out for the Vancouver building bylaw, as I mentioned, yet for the next edition, but I expect they'll probably adopt a lot of these things as well, or at least they won't go less than what's in there. They might adopt additional requirements, but likely you'll see a similar thing if you're mostly doing work in Vancouver. So I've covered some of it here. It's pretty high level because it's not something that we know too much about yet. I'm hoping anyways that the province will provide more information closer to the adoption date next year. I'm hoping they'll provide some diagrams and things like that. I've heard sort of that we should expect that, but you never know, these things take time. So it seems like we're always getting information last minute these days, unfortunately. So in general, there's a few things that will apply kind of throughout. Special outlet boxes and cover plates for future strobes. So this is something that I believe is in Vancouver currently, but everywhere else, this will be the same. So this will apply to, I should maybe go back one slide. So 385 will apply to one-story dwelling units served by an accessible interior public corridor and an accessible common building entrance. So most apartment style buildings. And then also, common facilities. If you have a townhouse or single family dwelling, anything that's not a sort of apartment style, the only thing you'll really need to meet here is the reinforcing for grab bars. So with that in mind, apartment style buildings will have to have these special outlet boxes and cover plates for future strobes. They'll have to have at least one adaptable bedroom, bathroom, living space, and kitchen where provided. If you just have a studio apartment, it might not have a separate living space. That's fine. But the bedrooms / kitchen space, living space would have to be adaptable along with the bathroom. And then clear floor space at doorways has to be met, and then accessible hallways and corridors need to be provided. So it does go into more detail in each of the articles about what that means. So for example, doorways, you have to provide 850 millimeters clear width connecting living space, adaptable bedroom, bathroom, and kitchen. If you have 2 bedrooms, you don't need to make them both adaptable. Just at least one of them has to be adaptable. Similar with the bathroom, you don't have to have all of your bathrooms be adaptable, but at least one of them would need to be. The clear floor space requirements are the same for the doors as they are in the rest of the accessibility section. There's no reduced width. It's this thing still, this table. It does note that you can use a rough-in for a future power operator to reduce those clear floor spaces. So if you're really having a hard time meeting them, that is an option. I know that that's been done in Vancouver quite a bit. You would still have to meet these requirements though for the power operator. So just be aware of that. And then hallways have to be a minimum of 1,000 millimeters. So it's the same as an accessible hallway. You can have the narrowing like in this diagram still, that's fine. And this would apply to each of your adaptable bedroom, bathroom, living space. So if you have other rooms that don't need to be adaptable, you wouldn't have to meet that. I'll just go into a bit of specifics here for a couple of the spaces. So the bedroom, it says you need to have a clear floor space next to the bed. You need to have 1,700 diameter or this 1,700 by 1,500 box. So this is my attempt at playing architect here, drawing out a room that This seems to me it's very, there's obviously a lot of different configurations you could use, but this is just maybe one example. And then there's a minimum width for a closet, and then you have to have your clear floor space in front of that. One interesting thing to note is in the body of the code, there's nothing about bed size. So it doesn't say, oh, you need to meet a queen bed or a bed of this size in the adaptable bedroom. But in the notes, it does say that you should have a bed that sleeps 2 people, because it's in the occupant load section of the building code. It requires you to consider 2 people per sleeping room for occupant load in dwelling units. So I think that's interesting. I would encourage you to do this as much as possible. It obviously increases the size of your bedroom. I think micro suites are going to be an interesting topic when it comes to these things, or very small suites, because it might be challenging to meet all these requirements. It might mean that they can't be done. I'm not entirely sure yet. So anyways, that's just an interesting note. I would encourage you to maybe have a read through some of these things just to form your own opinions. And the last thing we'll touch on here are just the bathrooms and the kitchens. I haven't drawn out anything for bathrooms. I think that as the architecture community, this is something that you should have a look at and try and come up with what types of configurations are the most efficient space-wise. The biggest thing is that you do need a clear lateral transfer space for the toilet. So a lot of traditional bathroom layouts where you have a sink, a toilet, and then a bath or a shower won't meet this. So you do need to have either a larger space or some sort of rearranged space. And then you also do need to have accommodations for reinforcing in the walls. You don't have to provide grab bars, but you have to provide reinforcing. And that means your toilet needs to be next to a wall, which often it's not in most sort of traditional layouts. So that's, I think, a pretty significant change, maybe more so than any of the other stuff in this section. And then finally, with kitchens, cooktop and sink need to be adjacent or have a continuous counter between them. So this type of layout here, where you have an island kitchen with a sink and no counter between the cooktop and the sink, you can't do that anymore. You could have your sink over here where it's not like right next to your cooktop, but it's at least has a continuous counter between the two. I think that's just to help people who have limited strength to kind of move things between the two if they need to. And then a clear floor space. This is potentially difficult to meet with a layout or an island layout like this. You need to have a 1700 diameter or 1700 by 1500 clear floor space within your kitchen. I did talk to one architect about this, and we were thinking maybe if your island wasn't like a permanently installed thing and it could be removed relatively easily without disrupting the finishes, perhaps that's acceptable. I think it's something that we'll have to grapple with a little bit as the design community. And then future accommodation for accessible sinks. So you don't have to have an accessible sink, you just have to make sure you accommodate one. So there is a little bit of, renovations that are anticipated if somebody does need to, or somebody does require some of these accommodations. It's not expected they can just move in here and have everything work perfectly for them. So I think the whole clear floor space thing and how do you accommodate an island will be a interesting topic in the next year or so. So with that, we're done. Here's a fun slide just kind of showing all of our the huge list of changes. I would encourage you to search out that BOABC list because it does kind of cover everything. I think it's quite helpful. And yeah, I think with that, we will move on to our question period, unless Brian, you had anything else you wanted to share?
No, I don't have anything specific. I think that was excellent, Mark.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mark. Yeah, really appreciate that. And I know this adaptable units, adaptable dwelling unit changes causing a lot of concern among our industry, especially because
Yeah,
if you're starting a project now, like chances are you're gonna have to comply to these new rules. What my office is actually working on right now with the CHBA and with BC government is actually trying to find some clarity over a lot of this ambiguity. So we've been
yeah.
working with them to
Okay, well, that's great.
to
Good to know.
find the size of the bedroom, for example, is a big concern,
Right.
and how that will work. But also, you touched on there with your idea about the kitchen island, the degree of change or the degree of construction that can take place and still be classed as adaptable.
Yeah,
That is
exactly.
not clear. Um,
Exactly.
yeah, so we're working on that as well. And also, there's also talk of what projects this affects. So we're talking to local government about this as well. Sorry, to BC government about this as well. Yeah, there's talk of there being some relaxation for projects that are in stream, but none
I
of
see.
that's been clarified yet.
Yeah, yeah.
So
Well, it's good to know that you're involved in that and that the questions are being asked, I guess.
absolutely. Well, it's huge. The developers are very concerned. Let's say that
Yeah, yeah.
because it could have especially on smaller units, could have a major impact
Yeah, for sure.
on unit sizes
For
and
sure.
affordability and potential knock-ons to sustainability as well. So we need clarity
Yeah.
around.
I know there are a lot of conflicting priorities because the government is keen on providing more housing and then they're also keen on accessibility. So, how do we do all these things? It's definitely a challenge.
Absolutely. So we'll share obviously when we find some clarity and results relating to this, we'll share that information. So a few questions here. So firstly about the AIBC points, Bayer has shared a link in the chat box there. She'll probably share it again in a minute. Please feel free to click on that, and there's a 3-question survey there you can fill out with your AIBC membership number. The recording will be shared by email. So if you signed up with your email address, which I think everyone has, a link to the recording of this presentation will be shared. There were a few questions. Tony asks, does the 10% combustible cladding on exterior walls also apply to soffits?
There's no restriction on soffits. So in a 6-story combustible building, I believe you're okay to have a combustible soffit. It's just the cladding that's restricted. At least that's been the interpretation that I have seen.
Good. Michael asks, do temporary janitorial staff, are they included in the calculations for water closets?
Temporary, like staff who maybe come on site.
Yeah.
No, so if it's somebody like that, like it's just for water closets, it says to use 3.1.17. So for that, you would you'd use all the areas in your building and figure out how many people based on the area. So if you have someone who's coming in from outside, just like one day a month or something for cleaning, they wouldn't be considered in that. So then you wouldn't need to provide washrooms for them. Now that's the code minimum. I think it's certainly something to consider. If you have, an apartment building and somebody's going to be cleaning it and they might be there all day, then it might make sense to provide it, but I don't think the code would require it.
Good. This is a good one. This one actually we've spoken to you about. Jason asks, any code changes affecting exterior doors on private balconies and rooftop patios? So this will be about curbs, effectively curbs from onto their decks or balconies.
There's nothing about curbs. So I did look into the adaptable section. There's nothing specific in that about balconies. So the way that I've read that is that you don't have to provide a flush sill for a residential balcony, even in an adaptable unit. Now, obviously, I haven't had to discuss that with anybody, or I haven't really discussed that with anyone yet. So I would just be cautious about that. But as far as I know, it's not a requirement. I don't think the code really deals with balcony thresholds very well, to be honest. Vancouver has a bulletin on it, and I think a few other municipalities have bulletins on this issue, but there's not a lot of guidance on how high and wide these things can be. But I think for adaptable units, for now, it's probably okay to assume that you don't need to provide an accessible balcony for those units.
It's another question that we've talked with you about, actually, Mark. So it's in relation to kitchen islands. The free swing space underneath, would it be similar to a universal WC sink? So if you're in a wheelchair and you can swing underneath a kitchen island, how does that work? How does that get you?
Yeah. Yeah, when we were discussing it, I think we said it would be okay. Like that's sort of my initial thought. Again, I haven't had to apply this yet, so sometimes, once you come up against a specific project, you kind of rethink these things. But my initial thought was that if you have like a countertop that's projecting into that clear floor space a bit, but you can still swing through there with your feet, if you were in a wheelchair, for example, that seems reasonable to me, similar to the universal washroom where you might have, a sink or some fixtures kind of projecting into that area somewhat. But obviously there's probably a limit to that, but I think a little bit is reasonable.
Okay. Kate, when you were discussing accessibility of elevators, Kate asks, how will this affect lifts? Like Gallivant lift, platform lifts, will the dimensions apply to those?
That is a good question. I don't have the answer to that right off the top of my head. Let's see if it's on my slide. Not sure. I will have to review that. If you want to send me an email about that one, maybe I can get back to you.
And I guess a final one here about accessible doors. If two doors in series swing inward into the same vestibule, what's the new required clearance between the two swings?
Good question. I believe that has changed from 1500 down to 1300. Don't quote me on that, but I believe it has reduced. So that would be covered under 3836, which is doors. I think it's the last thing in that section. It says, we have two doors in series swinging, or two doors in series. It doesn't matter if they're swinging into the same space or not. As soon as you have two kind of in series, there's a minimum distance. It's just the distance plus the door swing. So if you have two that are swinging into that same space, you have to consider both of the door swings.
Fantastic. Maybe just worth a couple of questions here regarding the adaptability. I think it might be worth just providing some clarity, Mark, on what is going to be implemented in March 2025 and what is effectively has to be complied to now. So obviously the accessibility.
Yeah, sure.
Adaptability.
So with adaptability, all of the whole of 385 that's in the 2024 code, that will be adopted next year. So what you do right now is you actually look at the 2018 BC building code, which is a bit strange, but there's a ministerial order that gets issued that tells you that when the new code is adopted. So in there, it says right now, it's not the 2024 385 sections, it's the 2018 385 until next year. Now, with that being said, the 2018 adaptability requirements are not mandated in the code. The only time you would have to apply those is if a municipality, it was part of their building or zoning bylaws required a minimum number of these adaptable units. It doesn't actually tell you in the code when or where you need them. I think sometimes certain municipalities will provide incentives to provide some of those, like bonus density for a development, things like that. Others may just require it as a part of a rezoning or something. But as of right now, you just apply the 2018 requirements. Whether you need those or not is going to come from somewhere else other than the code. But if you do need them, you look at the 2018, and then starting March 10th of next year, it'll be what's actually in the 2024 BC Building Code. So it is a bit confusing for sure.
And it's what's interesting actually is it comes from proposed changes to the national code, and it's BC that has opted for 100% of units to be adaptable. That you might find other provinces choose different percentage of of units to be adaptable. And just to answer another question here, it's really quite up in the air right now as to when this is going to come into play in terms of the way the code is written. And correct me if I'm wrong here, Mark. As soon as that any buildings that have not been submitted for BP at that date in March 2025 will then have to comply with these new codes. But obviously there is talk, as I said, mentioned, of in-stream projects somehow being grandfathered on and not having to comply with this new code. So we're waiting for clarity on that, and we're waiting to see. There's a lot of uncertainty here.
Yeah, no, I agree with that for sure.
Fantastic. Well, I think that's the end of the questions, but thank you very much. Thanks for everyone that attended, and thanks to Mark and to Brian for organising this, and potentially we'll do another one of these in the future.
Once we have more clarity.
Fantastic.
Clarity,
Thank you very much, guys. Cheers. Take care.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Hope you have a great day.